Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on working safely in the age of COVID and vaccinations. My name's Adrian Phoon. I'm the head of content at GRC Solutions, and on behalf of everyone at GRC, I'd like to begin by paying our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands in which we gather. For me today, that's the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. Now, GRC Solutions develops and delivers customizable online compliance training on all kinds of topics for all kinds of industries. But one topic that I think applies to everyone is work health and safety. And work health and safety is really the crux of the issue for today's webinar. Before we dive into conversation with today's guest, who is sitting and waiting very patiently there, I think it's worth taking a step back to reflect for just a second on how much the pandemic has transformed our lives in such a short space of time. So many of the words and concepts that are familiar to us and have become so embedded and ubiquitous in our lives today, like social distancing, self-isolation, hotel quarantine, and now mandatory vaccinations, were not even part of our daily conversation just 2 years ago. There's been a lot of information for us to process and absorb, both collectively and individually. And there are times when we've devoured that information, from tracking daily case numbers to tracking vaccinations. But I think it's also fair to say that there are times when many of us have felt a little bit overwhelmed by all the information at our disposal. And perhaps we've asked ourselves whether we really need to track all that information quite so closely. Complicating things even further is the sheer amount of misinformation, conspiracy theorizing, speculation, and just information that has yet to be properly researched and tested. Now, over the past couple of years, governments, agencies, and companies of all stripes and colors have tried to implement health and safety rules that regulate and protect our communities. But there's also been a recurring skepticism of authority and a certain distrust of anyone tasked with implementing and enforcing these rules, or I would argue, any rules at all. Understandably, there's a pervasive line of questioning about whether the right rules are in place at the right time. Are the rules too strict? Are the rules not strict enough? Have the rules come into effect fast enough? There's also been growing confusion, I think, and what I would call compliance fatigue, even among those people who have tried to abide by the rules at all times. And how do you all keep track of the rules when the rules themselves seem to change, not just between countries, states, territories, and local councils, but also from month to month or week to week? So this is the situation, I think, that we find ourselves in today. And in this environment, it can be incredibly difficult to reassert any sense of normalcy for any length of time. Yet as more and more Australians come out of lockdown, as restrictions continue to ease throughout the country, as our kids go back to school, and as many of us return to our shared working environments, that's exactly what we're trying to do, while acknowledging that COVID-19 remains very much a part of our lives. So joining me today to sort through some of the issues at hand, and I will say some of the issues because I think it's impossible to cover all of these issues in one short hour, is Aimee Barclay, founding director of the legal consulting firm Adprim Solutions. And Aimee has over a decade's experience in financial regulation and compliance, energy regulation, commercial law, advocacy, and private client work. Aimee, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm joining from Canberra today, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. So for me, that's the Ngunnawal people. As I said, pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to having a chat through some of this big web of complex issues related to COVID-19 and the return to work.
Fabulous. There really is quite a lot to discuss, and I'm sure that we've got some questions out there as well from our audience. What I will say is, if our audience does have any questions, you are very welcome to use the chat function provided. But if I can get in first with a question, I suppose it's the big question that lies at the heart of everything we're talking about today. What is the status? What is the official status on vaccine mandates? Can employers mandate vaccines?
Yeah, well, as you say, Adrian, this is the big one, the big ticket item. And unfortunately, there isn't really an official status. It's a bit more of a grey area, and it's extremely difficult for businesses to try and navigate through all of the different regulations and guidance and legislation. So the federal government hasn't really provided any guidance on that particular point. So it's really been just left down to each of the individual states and territories. And each one of those has taken its own individual approach. So essentially, what seems to have happened is that the states and territories have mandated vaccines via public health orders, where they consider it to be essential. So just a sort of high-level overview on that. So, for example, in Western Australia, there's actually quite a sweeping mandate in that part of Australia. So that's going to cover up to 75% of the workers in that state. So really big mandate there. In Victoria, there's a mandate which is going to cover any business which is on what they call the authorised providers list, which is essentially businesses that have been able to open during lockdown, so cafes and that kind of thing. And then in New South Wales, the mandate is for a smaller range of businesses, so hairdressers, gyms, libraries, etc. Excuse me. And then in the Northern Territory, again, quite a wide mandate. So it's going to cover quite a wide range of industries. There's going to be 3 categories of workers, but they will all have had to have their vaccinations by the same date. And then the other states have taken a slightly more of a light touch approach. So South Australia, ACT and Tasmania have mandated for a much smaller number of sectors. So those are the public health orders. And as you alluded to earlier, constantly changing. So really important for employers just to keep on top of those public health orders to ensure that they know what their obligations are to their employees. So for businesses that fall outside of those public health orders, it's really down to them to make their own decisions on whether they want to mandate vaccines. But just keep in mind that it needs to be lawful and it needs to be reasonable. And that's something which would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, unless there's a contractual requirement for vaccination and an enterprise agreement or something like that. So just keep in mind that there is a statutory duty of care to employers to ensure, excuse me, one second.
Go for it.
Thank you. To ensure the health and safety of their workers as far as is reasonably practicable. So essentially, as far as is reasonably practical. And whether that includes mandating vaccines would really be determined on an individual basis. And it may well be the case that employers determine that it's necessary to mandate vaccines for certain roles within its business, but not other roles. So, for example, there may be employees within a business who have more of a public-facing role, and so they would be determined to be higher risk in terms of contracting COVID-19. So maybe the employers decide that they want to mandate for those. But I think we really need to consider the bigger picture. So, for example, let's think about a consultancy firm where they might be doing visits to client sites. So the employer might say, okay, well, they're high risk, so let's mandate for them. But then you also have to consider, what about when they then return into the office and the other employees that you may have determined to be lower risk, there's then a risk of exposure between those 2 different types of employees. So it's really something which would be determined on a case-by-case basis per employer. And risks to individual employers are obviously going to be different as well, different industries, different roles, even within one company. So it's a bit of a minefield. But one thing is really clear. It's really important that employers consult with their employees before they implement any kind of workplace policy on COVID-19 vaccinations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for a number of reasons. So it might be that the employer has a duty to do so, whether contractually or legally. But it's also really good practice. So employees want to be involved in that process. They want to feel that their opinions are being heard and they want to have their input. They just don't want to be told by senior management or the CEO that that's what they have to do. So it's really important to consider that consultation process.
Mm-hmm.
So just in terms of the legality of the situation for employers, it's not something which has been tested by the courts yet outside of public health order mandates. So, for example, in New South Wales, there were some challenges to public health order vaccine mandates, which were dismissed. But as I said, nothing yet for outside of public health orders. But there have been some recent decisions by the Fair Work Commission around mandatory flu jab mandate. So around claims of unfair dismissal because of refusal to get the mandatory flu jab. And they were rejected by the court or the commission. And so the courts have essentially sided with the employers in these particular cases. So it might be an indication on how the courts will consider similar issues around COVID-19. So I think just a couple of other things on this point. It's important for employers to keep in mind that vaccines, they're not the be all and end all. It's a great way to mitigate your risk and try and limit that exposure to COVID. But it may well be that the courts don't consider that particular step of the vaccine mandates to be reasonable if other measures aren't also put in place. So whether that's mask wearing, social distancing, those kind of things. So it should really be a holistic approach to try and mitigate that COVID risk. And obviously, like any kind of blanket rule, there's going to be exceptions to vaccine mandates. And, in that situation, outside of the public health order arena, it would really be best to discuss that with the employees and understand what their reluctance is. So yeah, quite a lot of information there, but essentially, unfortunately, no one size fits all. It's really going to be down to the individual employers.
Yeah, I think I take that point that there really is no one size fits all, and now we are seeing a lot of these sort of potential issues being put to the test or being flagged ahead of time. I can see a couple of questions that have already popped up here, which kind of tie in with my next question, which is about who might bear liability for side effects from vaccines, who might bear liability if a worker contracts COVID at the workplace. But if I can just sort of like specify or touch on some of the questions that we've gotten here. So Rod is asking, does a company mandating vaccination potentially create discrimination of those that cannot be vaccinated due to personal health issues? And I will also mention this question from David. In the absence of mandatory staff vaccinations, how might a mutual defend itself against an employer who contracts COVID and claims in negligence or under the rebuttable presumption within the workers' compensation scheme that mutual was responsible for the employee contracting the virus? So I think there are a lot of issues here where people are quite understandably wondering about liability, whether you're mandating a vaccination or not. So could you perhaps just sort of touch on a couple of those issues? And I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a look first of all at who would bear the liability for potential side effects or adverse reactions from vaccines. So look, Adrian, there is a potential risk here to employers that the employees may have a workers' compensation claim for any adverse reaction to the vaccine. And that would be particularly if the employer has strongly encouraged or mandated the vaccine, because then it's more likely that the injury would have been suffered in the course of employment, which is the legal threshold. But it's important to note that the federal government has implemented a COVID-19 vaccine claim scheme. So that covers any loss in excess of $5,000. So I think that should provide employers with at least a level of comfort that if they do want to go down that route of mandating or encouraging vaccines, that they would hopefully face either little or no liability for any particular side effects or adverse reactions. So employees could still go down the traditional route. That's not been prohibited, but on the basis that it's quicker and simpler to bring a claim for adverse side effects or reactions through the scheme, hopefully they would choose to go down that route rather than the traditional route. So I think the key takeaway is that although employers could be liable for claims of less than $5,000 for any adverse reactions where the injury has been suffered in the course of employment, there is a scheme now in place, which is actually very recent, but I understand that it's been backdated to the beginning of this year. So as I said, hopefully it will give some level of comfort that if employers do go down that route of mandating vaccines, that they can do so without any sort of severe liability and consequences.
Yeah. Even more questions coming in here as well, by the way.
Okay.
And clearly this is such a hot topic for everyone at the moment, but I'll just flag that a couple of people have already asked questions about what happens with an employer that operates across multiple jurisdictions. And so we'll sort of get to those questions in just a little bit, but sorry, Aimee, please go on.
No, all good. I was just going to come back to the other point that I think one of those questions that you asked previously had raised, which is what if a worker contracts COVID at the workplace? So similar to the side effects, again, there is a potential risk to employers, but it would really be determined on an individual case-by-case basis. So there are some states that have enacted legislation so that certain essential workers are presumed to have contracted COVID at work. So I think New South Wales is one of those, and it would cover, essential workers like, nurses, doctors, and those kind of people who would be presumed to have contracted COVID at work. So they don't have to then prove it. But unless an employee falls under that particular regime, there are a couple of hoops that they would need to jump through. So there's two things. So they must show that COVID has been contracted in the course of employment, and that the employment significantly contributed to the employee contracting the virus. So I think it's just important to just remember as an employer that it's important that you try and mitigate your employees' risks as much as possible, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. But just as a bit of a highlight in a case study, there's been a few recent cases where employers have been held liable for the death of an employee, and one which has hit the press lately, which some of the participants may well be aware of, is Mr. Sarah. So Mr. Sarah, this was a milestone case, but essentially he had travelled from Australia to the US in 2020 on a business trip, and he contracted COVID-19 during the trip. And sadly, he passed away from complications caused by COVID-19. So the case was heard by the New South Wales Personal Injury Commission. The applicant in the case was Mr. Sarah's widow, and the respondent was the company in Australia that he worked for. And the key question for the commission was whether he was travelling in the course of his employment when he contracted COVID. So the respondent had argued that he was actually employed by the US arm of the company. So there was a company, like half the company was based in Australia, half was in the US. And they tried to argue that he was actually employed by the US one, and so he wasn't travelling in the course of his employment. But that was rejected by the commission, and they determined that he was travelling in the course of his employment, and that substantially contributed to him contracting the disease. And so the upshot of that was that the commission has now ordered that the respondent's insurer pay for death benefits and funeral expenses amounting to over $800,000 plus compensation payments. And it's also in the process of considering whether medical expenses amounting to around about 11 million US dollars are going to be payable to Mr. Sara's widow. So I think in summary, as I said, potentially there is risk here, and it's really important that the employers implement as many mitigation measures as they possibly can, just to try and lower their risk of that exposure to workers' compensation.
Thank you. That was such a sad story. I was reading about that this morning myself, and there's so many sort of tricky and thorny issues that sort of come out of that. So just to sort of follow on from that, there's a question from Chris. If an employer has to operate across multiple jurisdictions, what would you recommend as the benchmark or referral point for employers to use in their policies? Is it a case of continually monitoring public health orders and updating your policy to reflect the strongest advice?
Yeah, well, look, public health orders are quite clear-cut. So when there's a public health order in place, it's quite clear-cut, as I said, around which particular employees need to have that vaccine. And so it's, as I said earlier, it's absolutely essential that employers are monitoring those public health orders in each and every state in which that business operates, because it is going to be different. And so it might be that for whatever reason you might want to go over and above that and decide that you want to have a blanket rule, if you determine that it's legal and reasonable to do so, to have a blanket vaccine mandate for all of your employees, just so that you then don't have that individual state by state differentiation. So I guess there's kind of two ways that you could deal with that, but it's definitely going to be more difficult for companies that are operating in more than one state and territory.
Thank you. We do have one question here just about public health orders. Are public health orders only valid temporarily, and what happens when that validity period ends?
Oh, that's a good question. Look, they're valid for the length of time that they're valid for, and it's something that I would probably have to go away and maybe have a look at in terms of the longevity of that. But I would imagine that in each individual state and territory will make announcements separately as to whether those particular public health orders are coming to an end or if they're going to continue. I mean, the reality is that they probably aren't going to continue forever, because once each state and territory has reached the final date by which vaccines should have been received by, then there really is not much point in them continuing. But I guess the next question then will be, what happens when boosters become an issue? And so, they may well be mandated by the same public health orders.
Yeah, I think that makes sort of sense to me, like internal sense to me, because we have seen how COVID and the responses to COVID with public health orders has been such a moving feast. And so we've actually seen sort of successive public health orders as we've sort of adapted to the situation at hand. So I think that makes sort of intrinsic sense to me. We did actually get, just on the flip side of these sort of questions about multiple jurisdictions, we have had a very specific question as well from someone who works for an organisation in the Northern Territory. And I'll just read out this question. It's quite specific, but I think there are some elements that I think will be relatable to quite a lot of our audience out there. So just for context, the Northern Territory government has mandated the vaccine for all people who come into contact with Aboriginal people, which is our whole business. 80% of our workforce is Aboriginal, 99% of our customer base is, or members are Aboriginal. And we can't move people to other positions in the organisation as all positions come into contact with First Nations people. And also staff can't work from home other than senior management and account staff, as all other positions are client or customer facing. And so this caller is asking, can pandemic leave be used to give staff more time to comply? That's 2 weeks leave without pay. And also they're wondering what sort of disciplinary action can be taken, like stand down without or with or without pay, termination, and so on. So what obligations do employers have to employees who refuse to have the vaccine? So there's a whole complex of issues going on there. And I think in some respects, that's a very niche and specific thing. But again, there are some elements there that I think are relatable to many people today. What are your broad thoughts about that, Aimee?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Adrian. And I think that there's a few different issues just within those couple of questions there. So look, it sounds like for this particular participant that their business would be operating under a public health order. And so, as I said a minute ago, in terms of public health orders, it's actually pretty clear cut. So I think for the Northern Territory in particular, where there's a public health order in place, in order for those employees to enter onto the work site, they have to receive their first COVID vaccination by mid-November, I think. So I guess my first sort of almost question back or consideration would be, given that that's a couple of weeks away from now, what's the reason for needing the extra time? If it's down to the fact that there's a shortage of vaccines, then that's obviously a legitimate reason. But the basic conclusion on that point really is that you can't have employees coming back to the workplace who have not complied with those public health orders. There's quite significant fines potentially for employers and also for employees as well for not abiding by those public health orders. So if the employees are in a position where they can't work from home for whatever reason, if they're in a customer facing role, and they're not able to receive their vaccinations by the deadline, then I think it's going to be down to the employee and the employer to have a discussion, around any kind of extra leave that might be required in order to comply with those public health orders. So I think that sort of answers the first point. And then I think the next point was around people refusing to have the vaccine. Yeah. So yeah, I'm actually going to come onto this in a minute. So I'm happy to answer it. But look, essentially, it's all around the public health order, right? So if there's a public health order in place and you need the employee to come onto the work site to do their job, and they don't want to have the vaccine, there may well be a valid exemption. But for public health orders, and again, this differs between each state and territory, but I think for the Northern Territory, it's very, very specific. It has to be that there's a contraindication on the part of the employee to the vaccine, and therefore they receive medical advice that they can't safely receive any of the vaccines on offer, in which case an exemption may well apply. So in terms of refusing a vaccine, so it depends whether it's a public health order or simply mandated by the employer. But there's really not that much of a way around it if it's under a public health order, just because, like I said, there are fines potentially going to be imposed on the employer and the employee. And I can come on to talk about the implications of employer mandated vaccines in the next section as well.
Okay, absolutely. And so I will just acknowledge that we have also had a question from Karen with regards to exemptions. So we'll probably touch on that in just a little bit. But Karen's question is a medical certificate from a local GP sufficient evidence to justify someone not having the vaccine, especially for authorised industries that fall under the Victorian government vaccine mandate? So perhaps that's something that we might sort of cover off on just a little bit some later. But I did just want to acknowledge Karen's question there. Just conscious of time, there's a whole bunch of stuff I think that we're going to sort of get through in the next half an hour. But I just wanted to touch briefly on what other legal issues, broadly speaking, you think people need to keep in mind when it comes to sort of COVID and vaccines and returning to work. Because I do remember early on last year when the federal government announced the existence of a COVID app that people could download, that there were a lot of questions and concerns about privacy. And I wonder also in terms of sort of vaccinations, whether sort of record keeping and consent are also part of the mix and part of people's fears and anxieties out there. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about some of those other legal issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point, Adrian. So in terms of, so I think one of the legal issues, is can I ask my employees about their vaccination status? What are the ramifications of that in terms of consent and privacy and all those other flow-on consequences? So I think the first point here, which is really clear, is that it is essential that the employee freely consents to providing that information. They're not really, unless there's a public health order in place, and this is the sort of general caveat to most of these answers, then it really has to be down to the employee to provide that information. You can't mandate that. And then any request for the employee to provide evidence, so whether that's evidence of vaccination or evidence of a reason for exemption, it has to be lawful and reasonable. And again, that will depend on the circumstances of each individual business. So just something else to keep in mind is that there is a difference between asking about vaccination status and actually making a record and requesting evidence on the basis that the bar is higher for the collection of evidence under the Privacy Act. And so it would need to be reasonably necessary for the employer's functions and activities because it is going to give rise to those privacy implications. And we'll come on to talk about a couple of case studies later, which also touches on this. But vaccination status would be deemed to be sensitive information under the Privacy Act, and that's afforded a higher level of protection than other personal information. So there has been a bit of a warning from the Privacy Commissioner on this point, and they warned that collecting the evidence about vaccination status shouldn't just be on a just-in-case basis or simply for monitoring purposes. There has to be a genuine reason for needing to actually collect that information. So I think the point is that it's less onerous for the employer to simply cite the evidence. In some way, whether that's virtually or not, rather than actually take a record of it and then collect it into their database. But obviously, again, you have to keep in mind that there are public health orders which require the actual collection of the evidence. So I think, just in summary, just be careful about how you do it. It's all about you have to ensure that the employee consents to providing any kind of information, whether it's simply whether they're vaccinated or not. And then obviously the flow-on consequences from collecting evidence of a vaccine certificate or something similar.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned just then that you've got a couple of case studies. So I acknowledge that there are quite a lot of questions that are coming in, and I think quite a lot of pain points that people are sort of working through in terms of exemptions out there. What I'm just wondering is, it might be handy for us to have a look at a couple of those case studies, because I think people are quite interested to see how some of the big organizations in Australia are doing it. So I'm just wondering, and I suppose everyone just wants to have a bit of a sticky beak and see, what exactly are other people doing. So I'm just wondering if you could give a couple of case studies and just talk through what they're doing to sort of address and mitigate risk as their workers return to work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you say, it's always good to hear what some of the other bigger organizations are doing. So I was just going to have a look at a couple of the major banks, so CBA and Westpac in particular. So both of those organisations have announced a couple of weeks ago that they were going to implement a blanket COVID-19 vaccinations mandate. So initially there was going to be a consultation period, which I mentioned earlier is really important, some of which have now concluded. But it's important to note that these organisations are mandating vaccines for all employees in all states and territories. So even those states and territories which are currently COVID zero. So just a blanket mandate on vaccines. And they will come into effect upon the employees return to the workplace. So just talking about Westpac in a bit more detail. So the implementation dates are going to vary state by state. So I think in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, which is the lockdown states, so they'll need to be fully vaccinated by the 1st of December. And then Westpac has also requested that all staff across Australia are vaccinated by the 1st of Feb next year. And they're going to commence up the hybrid model, which we'll talk about later as well, hopefully, if we get time, of returning to the office somewhere between 1 to 3 days a week. So some from home, some from the office. And I understand that this has been quite well received. And it's given those employees also some certainty, around when they are going to have to go back to the office and when they need to be have their vaccination by. And CBA has taken a similar approach and a similar timeline. So again, variations state by state. But I think everybody needs to have had it by February of next year. And also, so not just for employees, CBA and Westpac have also said that they're going to mandate the vaccine for contractors, vendors and suppliers before they come onto any of their sites. But interestingly, they're not going to mandate for customers. So that might throw up some potential issues, around maybe some reluctance for the customer-facing employees for those banks if they know that the customers are not all going to be vaccinated. And just quickly touching on the privacy point. So my understanding is that the banks are going to go down the citing of the vaccination certificate route rather than actually storing as proof. And I think that's probably so that they don't fall foul of the privacy legislation as well. So I think there's probably going to be some issues, as there would be with any sort of blanket policy like that. There may well be some unhappy employees. So I understand that there's probably about 90% of staff who are fully vaccinated at those organisations or plan to be fully vaccinated. But that doesn't necessarily align with the amount of staff who agree with the vaccine mandate. So a couple of different issues, I think, to consider there. And just one other case study, just to give you an idea of a different industry. So BHP, they came out on the 7th of October and announced their COVID-19 vaccine mandate. And so, again, there's different timelines for each state and territory, but essentially everyone has to be vaccinated by the 31st of January next year. So that's workers and visitors to their sites and offices. And this is an interesting one because the CFMEU, which is the mining union, they've actually that they weren't keen on this blanket vaccine mandate. So I understand that for mining, there are public health orders in place in some states, but the particular gripe that the CFMEU had was around a particular site in Queensland. And I think that kind of stems from the fact that there wasn't a public health order in place there. And so they've actually raised it as a legal challenge with the Fair Work Commission. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the outcome of that case is going forward, because it will obviously then give some clarity around vaccine mandates and the legality of that. And just one final point on the case studies. So there are a few companies which have actually gone one step further, and they've decided to mandate vaccines for their customers as well. It looks like Best and Less, the clothing store in New South Wales, it looks like they're going to mandate vaccines for customers. Also, another big one is Qantas. So not entirely clear how it's going to look yet for those types of organisations in terms of how you prevent people coming into the store who have not been vaccinated. So again, it's sort of a watch this space situation, I think.
Which I think answers the question that came up just now. That Qantas is a reward for being double vaccinated, has provided an opportunity for customers to get some bonus frequent flyer credits, but request evidence of a full upload of the vaccination status certificate in order for this to happen. And this attendee is wondering whether this is actually allowable under privacy laws. There's a bit of a watch this space happening in that situation, isn't there? I will also say there is another question here, just speaking of a different industry. Our attendee says, I work in a school in New South Wales. Employees need to be vaccinated under public health orders. What fields or details are exactly allowable to be recorded for employee vaccination status? Can the employer ask for the actual vaccination status certificate or only site and record dates?
Yeah, look, that's quite a specific question because it obviously is under a public health order. So, look, I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head what the specific requirements are for the public health orders in New South Wales. I can certainly have a look into that and provide a response after the webinar. But there is actually quite a lot of guidance on each of the states and territories' website in terms of how businesses comply with those public health orders, but certainly one we can come back to.
Totally makes sense. I think, as we say, this is such a moving feast, isn't it? So it's very difficult. Well, one individual to certainly keep track of everything. Again, I'm just conscious of time, and I'm just wondering if we can now sort of move to talking about, I guess, a risk-based approach and how different companies and organisations might be able to sort of assess their risk and all the different risks that are specific to them. Because I think, we've sort of looked at a couple of case studies here about how different companies are doing it. We've sort of said that since the responsibility about mandates has sort of devolved onto companies, they will have their own sort of field, a constellation of concerns to address. So I'm just wondering, how can organisations approach working safely in this age of COVID and vaccinations from a risk-based perspective? And what does that actually involve?
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. So, look, I think the suggestion is that employers should take a sort of risk management approach to determine the control measures that they could implement to prevent COVID-19 in their specific workplace. And that is, it's really important just to keep in mind that that's going to be really different because there's so many different risks at play in different industries and for different companies. So the individual employer should carry out a risk assessment for their individual business. And as I said earlier, it might be that there's different risks for different employees, within that organisation. So it's really going to be taking quite a sort of practical approach to thinking about what those risks could be. So, obviously we're now looking at a return to work. So, for a lot of organisations, the risk has been quite low up until recently because everybody's working from home. And again, we're sort of talking outside of the public health order remit here. But it's going to be, looking at where those risks are. How is COVID going to be potentially transmitted in the return to work? So I think it's looking at the risks, putting controls in place in order to mitigate the risk, and just trying to be as pragmatic as possible about that. So look, it might be that there are certain public health orders in place that would affect all employees, for example, rules around square meterage and those kind of things. And that's going to be a case of monitoring the public health orders as well. But just to go through a few measures and mitigation strategies, just to try and reduce that risk of spread of COVID in the workplace. So I'll just run through a few ideas that can be utilised once you've done the risk assessment. And a lot of these, I think, can probably be applied across a number of different industries. So, for example, continue to work remotely if that's at all possible, or if you do need employees to come back into the office, then you could implement the hybrid model, which is how we just discussed. Some of the bigger banks are going to operate. And I understand the NIB, I think it is going to pretty much continue working remotely indefinitely. So, what works for one may not work for another, but it's whatever works for your business. So obviously encouraging or mandating vaccine, depending on the situation and whether you consider that to be lawful and reasonable. Good old social distancing. There's also a lot of guidance around ventilation, which is something that employers may not have thought about. But if you have a look on the Safe Work Australia website around, what the ventilation should look like. There's certain testing, so you could, in certain states, this is not allowed as far as I'm aware, but you could implement rapid antigen testing or temperature testing, all those kind of things. Another idea might be if you have one team all doing the same job, you could maybe split them in half, so you have team A and team B, so that they're never in the office all at the same time, and hopefully that would ensure business continuity in the case of an outbreak. Obviously, mask wearing if social distancing is not possible, and in some states and territories that's going to be mandated for a public health order anyway. Another kind of issue for some of the bigger employers who operate in quite large areas are the hot desking. I'm sure everyone's had to hot desk. I've certainly hot desked in a past life, and in the age of COVID, that's not really conducive to risk mitigation. So if that's not something that you can prevent, then obviously a thorough cleaning process between use. Another mitigation strategy might be the staggered start and finish times. You might be able to allow employees to start earlier and finish earlier to prevent them from having to travel on public transport during peak times, for example. And then, obviously limits on the amount of people in meeting rooms. And I think also it's really important to educate employees as well, on all of these different strategies that you as an employer are going to implement. So, really key one is obviously staying home when you're sick. Gone are the days where, we struggle in back into the office when we're feeling sick and sort of soldier on. That just doesn't fly anymore. So I think, education from the employer on what the expectations are around that as well. So, look, I think really important to do that risk assessment and work out where those risks are for your particular business. And that's just going to be so different from one employer to the next, particularly, if you have people who are sort of client facing within your organization. And then obviously another one is it's important to have a policy on what happens in the event of a COVID case when people are back in the office. What happens in that situation? Is there just a mass return to work from home? Is there like a deep clean? Or how do you ensure your business continuity if there's a COVID case when everyone's returned back to work? So a lot of things to think about.
Yes, absolutely. And I agree with you that I think there is such an important need right now for I think, continual education and training, again, because there's such a moving feast here, and because we need to sort of reiterate to employees, to everybody really, that they have their own specific work health and safety obligations here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just wondering then, if we can move then, I guess, from talking about what employers can do to I guess how employees can apply the concept of risk to everyday COVID situations. And I will just flag here a question that we've gotten from an attendee. So what is the legal position in relation to allowing customers who are not double vaccinated into our premises? If a customer claims to have been vaccinated, can we ask for evidence, taking the Privacy Act into consideration? What defence is available should that customer infect other customers or staff? So here I think there's a question about the vaccination status or COVID-related status of customers, but I suppose there's also implicitly a question here about employees who are customer-facing. And what they could reasonably say under the circumstances. I'm just wondering. I packaged up a couple of questions into that ball just then. I'm just wondering if you've got sort of any thoughts about that, Aimee.
Yeah, look, certainly on the first point, in terms of customers, you know, I'm not aware of any of the public health orders that have been put in place that require businesses to mandate for customers. I'd have to go away and check that point because it is quite specific. But I think from my understanding is that they're mainly around their own workers, which includes contractors, etc. So I have to check the specifics of that, and it may well be that certain types of business that there is, but I just need to check. Sorry, just remind me of the second half of the question, please, Adrian.
No. So we're just wondering here about how employees themselves. I suppose this is the big general question here, and I do know I just chucked a couple of questions at you.
Oh, good.
Tried to do a sneaky. But you know, how can employees apply this concept of risk to everyday COVID situations? Because I think, you know, we use the word risk all the time in sort of everyday language, but I think when you're talking about identifying COVID risk and you're talking about it in the context of your work, it's a little bit of a specific thing. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think a lot of it will come from my previous point on employers providing some education to employees, just so that they, you know, are aware of what they should be doing and how they should be operating, particularly in that return to work. So. And I think that really has to come from top down as well. You know, so senior employees have to do themselves what they expect all their employees to do. So if they're sick, they shouldn't come into the office, same as everybody else. So look, I think there's definitely measures that employees themselves can take. So, you know, for example, yeah, as I said, staying at home when they're sick. Just quite common sense measures, I would say, and this might be you know, a policy that the employer decides to put in place, but to stay at home when sick. Obviously, if you're showing any sort of symptoms of COVID, then go and get tested. And obviously, if it's positive, then you need that. You know, there's certain sort of flow-on consequences from that. Again, sort of social distancing, you know, around the office, and if you can't, then wear a mask. And obviously there might be some public health orders in place for each state and territory on this. Hygiene measures, you know, hand washing, that kind of thing. And yeah, just sort of being aware of your symptoms and knowing what to do, I think, in that situation. And it's, like I said, it's really important that the employer is able to educate on that, and that everybody's aware of what their obligations are as an employee. And then also what happens if there is a positive case, you know, what are those, what does that trigger essentially?
Thank you. I was just thinking about your point just then about social distancing, and, you know, we've been saying that one size does not fit all.
Yes.
And when we're sort of, even when individual organisations are trying to sort of prescribe rules around social distancing, I'll just say I did hear on the weekend about one very big company that that has factories and lots of workers in factories have said recently that they will ask workers to literally wear a buzzer. And so every time they get a little bit too close to each other because they sort of breach that sort of social distancing thing, it'll set off the buzzer. That's obviously not going to work for a lot of different organizations, and it'll probably seem like dodgem cars in the case if you're in an office, but that's actually the way that one particular organization has sort of sought to address that issue. So if we could just turn now, I think we've got a question here from an attendee. Should a hybrid roster, that sort of staggered sort of return to work, take into account who is vaccinated and who is not vaccinated?
I mean, potentially, but I think it really depends on the situation. So without any specific details around the industry and location, etc., it's quite hard to give a definitive conclusion on that one. But I think firstly, obviously, check the public health order. Sounded like a broken record now, but I think that's a really, really important point. So it might be that, you know, some of your employees are simply not allowed to come onto the work site if they're unvaccinated. So in that case, it's definitely a good alternative if you don't want to go down the disciplinary and termination route, if you want to keep that employee, to consider whether they can work from home. But then obviously if you decide that you want to or that you can mandate vaccine for everybody or certain roles, then that would also play into that. But look, you certainly could look at that, but I guess it might cause a bit of discontent between employees. You know, if some employees are allowed to work from home simply because they refused a vaccine, and you're requiring other employees to come to the office because they've had the vaccine, then that might not work in terms of, you know, internal politics between employees. So I think just think about that one carefully, you know, if you wanted to do that.
I think when we're talking about that hybrid model, there are actually a lot of different ways to approach the sort of hybrid status. And I think some of the issues that come out of that question, which we thank you for, is that there are sort of cultural and personal sensitivities, not just legal ones. There are a whole lot of different nuances there. If I can turn back to a couple of questions that came up earlier. So Julian's asked a question here. Victoria has just introduced new pandemic laws, which means that people found guilty of intentionally and recklessly breaching public health orders would face 2 years in jail or a $90,000 fine. And the Premier will also get powers to declare pandemics and impact the public's right to privacy. Is that very much different to laws in other states? Is Victoria doing something that's quite unique to Victoria, or is that something that broadly falls within a category that other states and territories are sort of implementing?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Look, I think Victoria has gone hard. Look, I think if you look at what Victoria has been through over the last couple of years, out of all the states and territories, they've been hit the hardest. You know, I think they've had the longest period of lockdown in the entire world, or something like that. So I think they really want to go hard here, and I don't think that that's something which is replicated, to my knowledge, in other states and territories. I think that's probably like one layer above. That's not to say that it's not going to happen in other states and territories. But it's not something that I personally am aware of at this current point in time.
Yeah. I keep wanting to sort of use that word unprecedented, but I feel like we used that word unprecedented 4 million times last year when we first sort of came into the pandemic. So I won't do it this time. One last question coming from Victor. What exemptions are available as doctors are not providing exemptions as they're being rejected by AHPRA?
Yeah, exemptions is a tough one. And again, I hate to say it again, but it really depends on the public health order. So I think I gave the example earlier of the Northern Territory. So very, very specific exemption available there, which is where those workers or employees are not able to medically receive any of the vaccinations that are currently on offer. And so I think that the situation is different if if you as an employer are enforcing that mandate yourself, so if you fall outside of the public health order regime, then it's really down to the individual employer as to what your appetite is, to entertain those types of exemptions. I've heard of employers who are allowing exemptions on medical grounds, with or without citing evidence to that effect, potentially on religious grounds, for a couple of different reasons. And then there's the sort of the more philosophical arguments as to why people don't want to receive the vaccine, which probably haven't gotten off the ground quite as much as the other two. So it really depends on the situation. Public health order is very specific in each state and territory. If it's a employer mandated vaccine, then it's more down to the individual employer as to determine what's reasonable in the circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. So I will acknowledge that we've had quite a few questions that have sort of come in just the last couple of minutes. We are actually just coming to time. I can see that there are a lot of sort of questions and I suppose just general thoughts about whether there's a risk of being accused of discrimination against vaccinated workers not wanting to return to work with those unvaccinated. So there's discrimination coming from sort of lots of different angles. I think what we've sort of said and heard from you today, Aimee, is that so often this has to come down to, since the responsibility has devolved onto individual companies, companies really need to explore things case by case.
Yes.
And so much of this is yet to be tested in a court. So I think we're all sort of watching to see where it goes. I will just read out one comment from an attendee. When considering risks, perhaps a common sense approach should be adopted, an employer providing a safe environment versus discrimination allegations. Perhaps the bigger issue here is about the greater good in conjunction with and taking into consideration the lesser evil, i.e. should a person get infected and die versus am I being discriminated against because I don't want to be vaccinated? I think I will take that one as comment and as something for a broader reflection. But apologies if we didn't get to your question today, but thank you very much, Aimee, for all your time. And there's a lot of food for thought there.
No, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm happy to look at any questions afterwards as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aimee. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. Take care and be safe. Bye.
Thank you.